Aloha and welcome to Inside the Writer's Studio. I'm your host, Isla Allgood, and I'm excited today because we're going to have Duncan Dempster, someone who I've known for a number of years and met in the writers group. And Duncan will be sharing some of his writing, and then following that we'll do some talk story and learn a little bit about Duncan as a writer. So please, let's welcome Duncan.
Well, hello, I'm Duncan Dempster, and I'm here to read you a little bit of my writing. Today, I'm going to read 2 or possibly 3 poems I've written, which I have not yet published. And most of my writing has been fiction. I've published 2 novels, and I'm working on a 3rd, but I decided today not to read from the fiction, but to read some poetry. So I'll start right in with this. One that I'll start with here is called The Pair of Hands. See those 2 hands clasping there? Like as not, they're a lover's pair, frozen in and out of time, a moment's monument sublime. Some old artisan, rugged artisan, no doubt, conceived those graceful hands in perfect innocence. And when he'd hewn a jagged chunk from out a log, he took that hunk and worked with diligence. 'Twas then that God bent down and said, "Make me a hand, no, make 2 instead." And all the while the man, not hearing, pursed his lips and kept on shearing. He rounded edges, smoothed the face, and with uncanny skill and grace he worked his knife and awl. Through day and night he carved that stock, and hour by hour he watched the block continually grow small. He whittled hard with little aim, until an inspiration came. He stopped a moment, creased his brow, then carved anew with purpose now. He chipped and sanded, cut and scraped for quite some time, until he'd shaped a hand, both strong and true. With wrist and fingers molded rough, he saw he still had wood enough for not 1 hand, but 2. The old man's memory coursed the years back to an earlier day, and tears welled in his eyes as the dim scene shone for an instant of another's hand in his own. The moment passed, but the image remained long enough within his brain to guide him to his end. He put his mind to this new task with neither wit nor will to ask of God himself or friend the reason for his fervent urging. 'Twas just another job, but surging through his veins toward a new goal, an unknown energy fired his soul. With renewed power and God to guide his blade, he finished what he'd started, made it masculine and strong. Then from the remnant wood still there, he cut away till he'd laid bare a mate, both thin and long. With ebbing strength and dimming eye, the old man finished with a sigh his pair of hands, and with final touch he immortalized their vital clutch. "By God, I've done the thing," he said. "By God, indeed." Then bowed his head and prayed both deep and well. And one last time he looked upon his mortal work, then gazed straight on before his 2 hands fell. That was the first one I was going to read, and now I'll get to a second poem. It's called Casuarina Song. And for those who don't know what a casuarina is, it's simply the technical scientific name for the ironwood tree, of which we have many here in Hawaii. A lowly shingle, warped and gray and contoured soft by wind and spray, sang out to me from where it lay, half buried in the rampant grass, amidst sun-bleached boards and shards of glass, and told me what had come to pass. So many years ago they're lost, this land you see was whipped and tossed by time alone. No man had crossed its threshold save a wandering few who happened on occasion through to reach the sea and seek their due. Right here where you now rest once stood an ageless stand of ironwood. whose needles blessed this neighborhood with dulcet symphonies profound. So beautiful did they resound that angels stopped to learn the sound. Then lines were drawn and deeds were led, and men with good intentions set the boundary of their neighbor's threat. Those singing trees were chopped and burned. With dynamite soon the earth was churned. The music ceased and ne'er returned. No longer does the wind excite those tendrilled fingers in its flight across the fetch to plant delight in ears unseen and minds withdrawn. The casuarina's plaintive song was once forever lost and gone. The lonely shingle breathed a sigh with a tear lodged in its eye. It bade the ironwoods goodbye. The breeze that once had dared arouse those lofty casuarina boughs no longer sing their vesper vows. I think I might have time for a third poem, which I'll go right into. It's called Listen to the Children. I know a little angel who excels at teaching lessons. She teaches me to see the world through lenses clear and bright. And she brings her little friend along who's every bit her equal, and together they have tutored me and led me toward the light. There's a certain way of seeing things that children seldom miss. They strip away what's trivial and dive right down to the heart. They uncover basic principles that we've long since forgotten. They can catch us, teach us of the whole of things by showing us each part. Won't you listen to the children? Won't you watch their simple ways of dealing with their problems, which are just like yours and mine? For in truth, I've heard it said, although I've never understood it, that the child is parent of the man. It's part of our design. Have you ever known a child who couldn't make you want to cry by simply standing there in innocence and asking questions why? And the answers that you give are seldom true for many reasons, and you know it, and she knows it, and she's caught you in a lie. Yes, the children are our parents. They're the masters of our lives. For without an ounce of power, they are stronger than a king. They're familiar with the space between the colors of a rainbow. They can teach you how to smile again and show you how to sing. My children count the stars at night on all their toes and fingers. My children race into the rain with open mouths and eyes. My children gauge their sorrow by the wrinkles in my forehead. My children measure happiness by the sounds of my surprise. Does it matter that the stars above may number more than 20? Can you find a better gauge for joy than tasting summer rain? Is the sadness of a lifetime any deeper than your wrinkles? Listen carefully to the children and start learning once again. So that's my contribution to the Inside the Writer's Studio.
Thank you, Duncan. That was so interesting. You know, I've heard you read so many stories because you've been working on novels when I've been in writers group, and
Yeah.
So much came up for me with this last piece. First of all, overall, I feel like the world needs your poetry right now. It's very uplifting and kind of transcends something that's going on in the world. So thank you.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, and for people who don't know you, let's just visit with you for a little bit about your writing process. Like, when did you first think of yourself as a writer?
Well, it's probably, it's a hard one to answer because I never did think of myself as a writer. For many years, I guess I thought of myself as a manipulator of words, or someone skilled at the writing trade, but not this type of writing. Mm-hmm. I spent a good deal of my whole career and count my success in my career to writing skills, not fiction and not poetry, but just plain old weaving words together to make something meaningful. I started out in the U.S. Navy. I spent 21 years in the Navy. Had nothing to do with writing. As a matter of fact, all my experience in the Navy was strictly engineering type. But I managed to work my way up through various means, but primarily probably because I could write, I could handle the written word pretty well.
Well,
So,
it really comes through in your
really,
novels, and certainly in this, how you're able to put words together. And I found the rhythm of the poetry really pleasant to follow, along with your rhymes. I know sometimes when I write poetry, the rhymes feel like I'm trying too hard,
yeah.
but yours seem to flow quite nicely.
I always, I'm very aware of that, because now, in this day and age, this latter day and age, people are rather critical of rhyming poetry. But I like to stick to it for various reasons, and I think it works. I've written a few things that are not rhyming, but they're not very good. So I'm going to stick with the rhyming.
I think the rhyming works when it works. You know, I think when someone tries too hard, or you know, it can feel like it's not working. But yours seems to flow quite well. And the first piece, I wanted to ask you what your inspiration was for that, because that was very unusual, about the hands.
Oh, the hands. Well, I'll put a picture up, and maybe people can see. There are the hands I was writing about. I don't know if you can see those.
Yeah, I can see it.
It was a little wooden sculpture, a little wooden carving of a male and a female hand. And this dates back to my childhood. This was an actual little hand sculpture that I remember my parents had, and it was always in the living room. And I was struck by how evocative the sculpture was. I didn't write the poem till quite a few years later, late in life. But I was intrigued by how something as simple as a hunk of wood that someone had carved could have so much stuff in it. And I think a lot of the poetry I write, and I don't write a whole lot, but has to do with looking at something very small, a micro view, and expanding that to a macro view of the world. This thing about the hands, yeah, I mean, the whole story, I don't know whose hands they were, but it was some little sculpture my parents had, and obviously they looked like, to me, a lover's pair. And so I just took off from there and made up this little story about this old carving guy who had decided to make that sculpture, and then when he had finished, that was his life's work, and his hands dropped. His two hands fell at the end.
I
Similarly,
love, so what that brings out about writing is, you were talking about how you felt like you were pretty good with the mastery of words as a skill, but this is taking that skill, and this is great for people to know who maybe are just getting into writing. There's the skill of writing, but then there's also the creativity of it. Like, you took this image and you developed an entire story around that image. So yeah, and then the next poem you read was about the ironwood trees, and as one who sees them here all the time, I loved you drawing me into your experience of the trees.
Well, this one, yeah. Once again, it's going from the micro up into the macro, and obviously it's a fictitious little story. But the way this one came about was, it was on Oahu when I lived in Honolulu, and it was a beach up on the windward side, where many casuarinas wave in the wind, and I was always taken by the sound of the music of the casuarina tree. The music is just beautiful. And so I just made up this little thing. I found a little piece of wood, which happened to have been a shingle from an old house. And I just imagined it had been originally a piece of it probably was a cedar tree, but I just called it a casuarina tree. And the shingle told the story of the casuarinas and how they started out early in the history of the world, and suddenly man took over and destroyed the land and the trees with them. But this little shingle remembered the whole story, and so it's once again it's a story of going from the micro to the macro.
You are certainly the storyteller. I mean, you do that in your novels. And what's the name of the novels that you've recently published?
Well, the novel originally is I'm actually working on a third one now. It's going to be a trilogy. The first one was Chapel on the Moor.
Chapel on the Moor.
And, right, and then the second one was Where Are You? And they're quite intimately related, but 50 years apart. Mm-hmm. Chapel on the Moor was the story of happened 50 years ago in the mid 20th century. And a story of a young man and a young woman who met quite by accident, and it was all involved in this chapel on the moor.
Right.
And then they separated. And 50 years later, they met quite by accident. And you have to read the books to know what's going on. But I'm now writing a trilogy on the thing, and I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to do it.
So what are you writing now, Duncan?
Pardon me?
What are you writing about that now? What is your book you're working on now?
The principal, the male protagonist of the first book, Frank, in the second book, he met up 50 years later with Merritt, the woman that he had known 50 years earlier. But of course, Frank is married and Merritt is divorced, is widowed. Uh-huh. And so I'm having this terrible conflict in Frank's mind about what can he do, because he still loves this woman, and they're in their 70s.
Oh, so now you're taking us.
It's not a young swashbuckling romance. It's not a modest romance or anything. It's the story of the progression of love and life through the years from the early years on up to being 70s and 80s.
Yeah. So, yeah. Well, that's good. We need to hear about that. That's awesome.
I'm not sure I'll go through the third one, but we'll see.
Well, let me ask you one last question about your writing, which is there an aspect of writing that you enjoy the most from the idea right to the finished product? Is there any particular part that you enjoy the most?
I think the one I enjoy the most, and if people will flinch when I say this, I enjoy the writing and the editing, the editing part most, because I'll start writing something and it'll be okay, but then I'll change it 10 or 20 times to make it just sound exactly right. That's the part I enjoy. Of course, I enjoy the final publication, but that only happens once, whereas the editing part happens all throughout the day. And
yeah. I wonder if that connects to your life as an engineer, that kind of fine tuning, getting.
Well,
huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It may well.
Well, thank you so much for being here today, Duncan, and thank you for all you do for the Hawaii Writers Guild. And I want to let people know that if you want to know more about the Guild, you can go to the website is www.hawaiiwritersguild.com, and there's also a Facebook page, Hawaii Writers Guild. So until next time, have a beautiful day, and aloha.
Aloha to you. Thank you.